The Tale of the Unextinguished Moon by Boris Pilnyak. Chapter 3. Garilov's Death. The first snow, the snow that leads the earth out of autumn into winter, always falls during the night, so as to lay a boundary between the autumnal slush, mist, sleet, fallen leaves, and street rubbish that were there yesterday, and a white, brisk winter day when all the cracklings and noises have vanished, and when, in the silence, a man has to brace himself, to direct his thoughts inward, and not to hurry anywhere. The first snow fell on the day of Garilov's death. A white silence descended, blanching and lulling the city. Blue tits that had flown in from the country with the snows were shaking snow from the twigs of trees outside the windows. Professor Pavel Ivanovich Kokosov always woke up at 7 o'clock, and it was at this hour that he awoke on the day of the operation. The professor stuck his head out from under the blanket, cleared his throat noisily, stretched out a hairy arm to the bedside table, felt for his spectacles with the habitual motion of the hand, and saddled his nose with them, setting the lenses into the thicket of hair on his face. On a birch, outside the window, a blue tit was scattering snow about. The professor put on a dressing gown, stuck his feet into his slippers, and went to the bathroom. The ceilings in Professor Kokosov's apartment were low, provincial. The professor must have lived 20 years or so in that apartment, because the leisure of at least a 20-year span must have been spent on that thoroughly rubbed-in dust, on those yellow curtains, on those faded pictures, on those leather-bound books, on wearing a hole in the couch, on polishing the felt cover of the desk to a silvery gloss, on the pointlessly neat disposal of every object in the house and on the desk, from the inscribed matchbox, a gift from his students, from the decaying pen covered with deerskin and made in the shape of a deer's leg, a memento of Switzerland, to the chamber pot under the bed, from which enamel was already chipping. It was quiet in the house at the hour when the professor awoke, but when he emerged, grunting, from the bathroom, his wife, Yekaterina Pavlovna, was already in the dining room, stirring sugar into the professor's tea, with a clink of spoon against glass. The samovar was hissing. The professor came out for his tea, in dressing gown and slippers. "Good morning, Pavel Ivanovich," said the wife. "Good morning, Katerina Pavlovna," said the husband. The professor kissed his wife's hand, sat down opposite her, settled his spectacles more comfortably into the hair on his face, and then, behind the glass of his spectacles, little eyes of a priest-like stamp became visible, eyes which were both amiable and cunning, simple-minded and intelligent. The professor took a swallow of tea in silence, preparing to make some customary remark, but the ritual of morning tea was interrupted by the telephone. A telephone call was unusual at this hour. The professor looked sternly at the door of the study where the telephone was ringing, looked suspiciously at his wife, a plump, aging woman, wrapped in a Japanese kimono, got up and went to the phone, every step expressing suspicion. The professor's words, spoken fretfully in what was meant to sound like an old man's voice, were swallowed up by the receiver. All right, I'm listening. Who's calling and what's the matter?" A voice at the other end of the line said that the call was from headquarters. They knew that the operation was scheduled for 8:30, and they would like to know if the professor needed any assistance. Should they send an automobile for him? And suddenly the professor lost his temper. He snuffled into the receiver and began speaking irritably. Let me tell you that I am a servant of society and not of private individuals. Yes, 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 of course, my good man. I take a streetcar to the clinic, my good man. I do my duty according to my conscience, if you don't mind, and I see no reason not to take a streetcar today." The professor banged down the receiver, cutting short the conversation, snorted, snuffled, returned to the table to his wife and tea. He snorted once or twice, chewed his whiskers, and very soon calmed down. His eyes became visible again behind his spectacles. Now they were wise and intent. The professor said quietly, "Let's say Ivan the peasant from the village of Rakinsky Lutzi gets sick. He'll lie on the stove ledge for 3 weeks. Then he'll say a prayer, groan a bit, talk things over with his family, and go to the district hospital to see the doctor. Pyotr Ivanovich has known Ivan for 15 years. During that time, Ivan has brought a couple of dozen chickens to Pyotr Ivanovich as payment in kind. Got to know all Pyotr Ivanovich's children as they came along, and even pulled one of the boy's ears for raiding his pea patch. Ivan will come to see Pyotr Ivanovich, will present him with a hen. Pyotr Ivanovich will look him over, listen to what he has to say, and, if necessary, operate quietly, calmly, competently. No worse than I would do it. And if the operation doesn't come off, Ivan will die. They'll put a cross over him, and that'll be the end of it. Or even, let's say, some Anatoly Yuryevich Sinvitsky comes to see me. He'll talk about his symptoms till he's hoarse. I'll look him over thoroughly, and look him over again, 6 times. I'll find out all I can about him, and then I'll say, 'Go home, my good man, and live with your ulcer. Be careful, and you'll live another 50 years. But if you die, well, there's nothing that can be done about it. God has called you, my good man. If he says to me, operate, I'll do it. But if he doesn't want it, I would never think of doing it." The professor was silent for a while. "There's nothing worse than consultations, Katarina Pavlovna. I have no wish to insult Anatoly Kosmich. Anatoly Kosmich has no wish to insult me. We pay each other compliments and show off our learning, and the patient has nothing to do with it, just like all the fuss at the Bolshevik trials. No one knows the patient properly. You see, neither Anatoly Kosmich nor Herr Schimann." The professor was silent for a while. "Today, I'm assisting at an operation at the hospital. We are operating on a Bolshevik army commander, Garilov." "The one who," said Yekaterina Pavlovna, "who, well, according to the Bolshevik papers, a terrible name. And why aren't you operating, Pavel Ivanovich?" "Well, there's nothing particularly terrible about him, of course," the professor replied. "As for why they picked Losovsky, such are the times we live in. Youth is all the rage. Young people have to make their reputations, and still, when you come down to it, nobody really knows the patient after all these consultations, even though all our big names have examined him thoroughly, prodded him all over, x-rayed him, purged him out. But they miss the main thing, the man himself. It's not a man they're dealing with, but a formula, some General X they write about every day in the papers to put the fear of God into people. But just you make one slip in the operation, and you'll end up in strange places. You won't even recognize your own father when they've finished with you." Again, the professor lost his temper, snuffled, snorted, hid his eyes in the thicket of his hair, got up from the table, shouted through the door leading to the kitchen, "Masha, my boots!" and went to his study to get dressed. He combed his eyebrows, his beard, his whiskers, his bald spot, put on his frock coat, thrusting a fresh handkerchief into the pocket of his coat tail, pulled on his boots with vamps polished to the shine of a samovar and chestnut tops. He looked through the window. Had the horse been brought up? The horse was already standing at the front porch. Ivan, the coachman who had lived in Professor Koskosov's kitchen for 20 years, was brushing snow from the seat. Professor Anatoly Kosmich Lososovsky's room was not at all like Kokosov's apartment. If Kokosov's apartment had preserved the atmosphere of Russia at the turn of the century, Losovsky's room had assumed its permanent shape between 1907 and 1916. There were heavy curtains, a wide sofa, naked bronze women served as candelabra on the oak writing table. The walls were covered with rugs, and over the rugs were hung second-rate paintings bought at exhibitions of the world of art. Losovsky was asleep on the sofa, and not alone, but with a young and beautiful woman. His starched dicky lay on a rug on the floor. Losovsky awoke, lightly kissed the woman's shoulder, got up energetically, and tugged sharply at the curtain rod. The heavy woolen curtain began creeping toward the corner, and the snowy day came into the room. Losovsky looked out joyfully at the street, the snow, the sky, as people look who are in love with the life pulsing within them. Carefully, as bachelors do of a morning, he looked around the room, and before going to wash in pajamas and lacquered slippers, he began tidying up the room. He removed an unfinished bottle of red wine from the table and stood it behind the bookcase. He placed a dish of biscuits on the lower shelf of the bookcase. He arranged an ashtray, an inkwell, writing pads, books on the table. He plugged in the cord of an electric kettle, poured coffee into the kettle. The woman who was asleep, and it was obvious that this woman was of the sort who love and give themselves up to love, quietly, devotedly. Waking up, she said, "Darling." She opened her eyes happily, caught sight of the brisk winter day, the snow on the trees, lifted herself on the bed, clasped her hands as though in prayer, shouted happily, "Darling, the first snow! Winter, darling!" The professor placed his white hands on the woman's shoulders, rested her head against him, and said, "Yes, yes, it's winter, my spring, my lily of the valley." At that moment, the telephone rang. The telephone in the professor's room hung on the wall near the rug over the sofa. The professor picked up the receiver. "Yes, yes, I'm listening." Headquarters was on the line. Should they send an automobile for him? The professor replied, "Yes, yes, please do. There's no need to worry about the operation. I'm sure it will be a brilliant success. About the automobile, yes, please, especially as I have to make a stop on business before the operation. Yes, yes, please. About 8 o'clock. The professor hung up and said to the woman joyfully and with pride, "Get yourself dressed, my little lily of the valley. An automobile will be coming to pick me up. I'll give you a ride and take you home. Hurry." And he embraced the woman, laying his head on her shoulder in the way that people do when they are very happy. It was already 7:45. The man and the woman got dressed hurriedly, happily. As he dressed, the professor poured coffee into the little Chinese cups. Smiling happily, the woman buttoned the studs of his starched dicky. Before leaving the house, the professor, with a solemn face and a sort of nervous respectfulness, made a telephone call. By means of all sorts of telephonic roundabout ways, the professor penetrated the network of about 30 or 40 lines in all, calling the study of house number 1. He asked respectfully if there would be any new instructions. A firm voice in the receiver suggested that he come with a report immediately after the operation. The professor said, "Goodbye, it will be done," bowed to the receiver, and didn't hang up straight away. An automobile was already roaring in front of the entrance. In the morning, on the day of the operation, before it took place, Popov came to see Garolov. It was not yet dawn, and the lights were still on, but there was no chance to talk because a nurse came to take Garolov to the bathroom to administer a final enema. As he left the room, Garolov said, "Alyosha, read that bit in Tolstoy's Boyhood about what is and what isn't comme il faut." What a feeling the old man had for the instincts in our blood. Those were the last words that Popov heard from Garolov. Popov went home in the rustlings of a frosty dawn quietness, went down a side street toward a steep bank facing the open spaces beyond the river. There, on the horizon, In a deep blue murk, beyond the snows, a blue moon was dying, and the east burned red, crimson, cold. Popov began to go down to the river to reach the city through the fields. Behind him burned the east. At that moment, Garolov was standing at the window, gazing across the river. Did he see Popov? Dressed in a hospital robe, in a bathroom by a window stood a man, a weaver from Orekovo-Suyevov, whose name had become overgrown with legends of war, with the legends of thousands, tens of thousands, and hundreds of thousands of men who had stood behind him, with the legends of thousands, tens, and hundreds of thousands of deaths, agonies, mutilations, of hunger, cold, the ice-covered ground, and the scorching heat of long marches, of the thunder of cannon, the whistle of bullets and night winds, of bonfires in the night, of marches, victories and routs, and again of thousands and of death. The man stood at the window in a bathroom, his hands clasped behind his back, looking into the sky, motionless. He lifted a hand and wrote on the misted window, "Death, enema, not comme il faut." And he began to undress. Just before the operation, people were hurrying back and forth along the corridor, connecting the operating room with Garilov's room, whispering, bustling about, noiselessly. The evening before the operation, a rubber tube had been inserted into Garilov's esophagus, a siphon to pump out gastric juice and to irrigate the stomach, the kind of rubber instrument that leaves a feeling of nausea and depresses the spirit, as if it existed for the purpose of affronting human dignity. On the morning of the operation, an enema was administered for the last time. Garilov came into the operating room wearing a hospital robe and shirt, and pants of coarse linen. The shirt had laces instead of buttons, numbered hospital slippers on his bare feet. They had changed his clothes for the last time that morning and given him sterilized things to wear. He entered the operating room pale, drawn, and tired. In the anteroom, alcohol burners hummed. Water boiled in long nickel-plated boxes. There were silent people in white gowns. The operating room was very large and painted all over, floors, walls, ceiling, with white oil paint. The room was unusually light because one entire wall was a window, and that window looked out over the river. In the center of the room stood a long white table, the operating table. Here, Garilov was met by Kokosov and Losovsky. Both were wearing white gowns, and both put on white caps, like cooks. In addition, Kokosov covered his beard with a napkin, leaving only his thick-headed eyes exposed. Along a wall stood a dozen people in white gowns. Garilov entered the room calmly, accompanied by a nurse. He bowed silently to the professors and walked to the table. He looked out of the window at the far bank of the river, clasped his hands behind his back. A second nurse brought in a boiling sterilizer containing instruments, a long nickel-plated box suspended from hooks. Losovsky asked Kokosov in a whisper, "Shall we begin, Pavel Ivanovich?" Yes, of course," replied Kokosov. And the professors went to wash their hands over and over again, to pour mercury chloride solution over them, to swab them with iodine. The anesthetist checked the mask and fingered his bottle. "Let's begin then, Comrade Garilov," said Losovsky. "Would you kindly lie down on the table? Take your slippers off." Garilov looked at the nurse and, slightly embarrassed, straightened his shirt. She gave Garloff a brief glance as if he were a thing, and smiled as one smiles at a child. Garloff sat down on the table, kicked off one slipper, then the other, and quickly lay down, adjusting the roller cushion under his head. Closed his eyes. Then, quickly, deftly, with practiced skill, the nurse buckled the straps around his legs, binding him fast to the table. The anesthetist laid a towel on the patient's eyes, smeared Vaseline over his nose and mouth, put the mask over his face, took his hand to check the pulse, and poured chloroform onto the mask. The sweet, astringent smell drifted through the room. The anesthetist noted down the time when the operation began. The professors moved to the window in silence. Using forceps, the nurse began to take out and arrange on the sterilized gauze scalpels sterilized towels, peons and coacher's clamps, pincers, needles, and silk thread. The anesthetist continued to add chloroform. Silence settled upon the room. Then, the patient began to jerk his head from side to side and groan. "I can't breathe. Take off the mask," Garloff said, and snapped his teeth. "Please, be patient a little," answered the anesthetist. A few minutes later, the patient began singing and talking. "The ice is gone, the Volga flows to sea. My golden one, my precious one, a foolish girl am I, and love has come to me," sang the commander, and then whispered, "Sleep, sleep, sleep." After a brief silence, he said sternly, "And never give me cranberry kissel again. I'm sick of it. It isn't comme il faut." He fell silent again, then shouted sternly, as he must have shouted in combat, "No, retreat, not a step. I'll shoot, Alyoshka. Brother, full speed ahead. The land is already out of sight. I remember everything, and so I know what the revolution means, what a force it is, and I'm not afraid of death." And again he began to sing. "Beyond the Urals lives in Carpenter my golden one, my precious one." "How do you feel? Aren't you sleepy?" the anesthetist asked Garloff softly. And Garloff replied in his normal voice, also softly, like a conspirator, "Not so good. I can't breathe." "Be patient just a little longer," said the anesthetist, and poured on more chloroform. Kokosov looked anxiously at the clock and bent his head over the patient's case history, read it through once more. An organism can react peculiarly to certain drugs. For 27 minutes they had been trying to put Garloff to sleep. Kokosov called over a junior assistant and thrust his head forward for him to adjust the spectacles on the professor's nose. The anesthetist whispered anxiously to Losovsky, "Perhaps we should give up chloroform and try ether." Losovsky replied, "Let's keep on with chloroform. Otherwise, we'll have to postpone the operation. Awkward." Kokosov looked around sternly and lowered his eyes, worried. The anesthetist poured on more chloroform. The professors remained silent. Garloff finally went to sleep in the 48th minute. Then, the professors rubbed their hands with alcohol for the last time. The nurse bared Garloff's stomach. The skinny ribs and flat belly were exposed. With sweeping strokes, Professor Kokosov rubbed alcohol, benzene, and iodine into the area of the incision, an epigastric region. A nurse brought sheets to cover Garloff's legs and head. Another poured half a bottle of iodine over Professor Losovsky's hands. Losovsky picked up a scalpel and drew it over the skin. Blood spurted, and the skin spread apart, sliding off layers of fat, yellow like mutton fat, with interlayers of blood vessels. Losovsky again cut into the human flesh, cutting through fascia, white and gleaming, interlaid with faintly lilac muscles. With a dexterity surprising in so bearish a man, Kokosov closed off blood vessels using peons and coacher's clamps. With another knife, Losovsky cut through the sac of the peritoneum. He put aside the knife and wiped away the blood with sterilized towels. Through the silt could be seen the intestines and the milky blue sac of the stomach. Losovsky put his hand in among the intestines, turned the stomach around, and kneaded it. On the gleaming wall of the stomach, on the spot where the ulcer should have been, was a scar, white, as if molded from wax, resembling the larva of a dung beetle, a scar which showed that the ulcer had already healed and that the operation was pointless. But at that moment, the very moment when Garalov's stomach was in Losovsky's hands, "Pulse! Pulse!" shouted the anesthetist. "Respiration!" Kokosov confirmed, automatically it seemed, and then Kokosov's eyes, full of anger, of terrible anger, started out from behind his thicket of hair and spectacles, started out and swept around the room, while Losovsky's eyes, close-set, pressing against the bridge of his nose, drew even closer together, sank deeper into their sockets, concentrated, merged into a single frightfully piercing eye. The patient had no pulse, his heart was no longer beating, his breathing had stopped, and his legs were growing cold. It was a heart shock. The organism had been poisoned by the chloroform it had rejected. It was a certain indication that the man would never return to life, that death was inevitable and could only be postponed for an hour, 10 hours, 30 hours, but no longer, by means of artificial respiration, oxygen, camphor, physiological salt solution. He would never again regain consciousness. He was, in fact, dead. There was no doubt that Garalov was to die under the knife on the operating table. Professor Kokosov turned his face to the nurse, thrusting it forward so that she could adjust his spectacles. The professor shouted, "Open the window! Camphor! Get physiological salt solution ready!" An even greater silence fell upon the silent crowd of assistants. As if nothing had happened, Kokosov bent over the instruments on the table, inspected them in silence. Losovsky bent over by Kokosov. "Pavel Ivanovich," he whispered furiously. "Well?" answered Kokosov in a loud voice. "Pavel Ivanovich," Losovsky said in an even lower whisper, but now the fury had gone from his voice. "Well?" replied Kokosov loudly, and said, "Carry on with the operation." The two professors straightened up, looked at each other, one with eyes fused together, the other with eyes starting out from behind a hairy thicket. Losovsky swayed back from Kokosov, as if from a blow, as if trying to focus his gaze. His single eye became two eyes, wandering about the room. Then they merged again, even more completely, even more piercingly. Losovsky whispered, "Pavel Ivanovich," and lowered his hands to the wound. He did not sew up the inner cavities, but merely blasted them together and began stitching the outer layers only. He gave an order. "Release arms! Artificial respiration!" The enormous window of the operating room was opened, and the cold of the first snow came into the room. Camphor had already been injected. With the help of the anesthetist, Kokosov was pulling Garalov's arms back and raising them, forcing him to breathe. Losovsky was patching up the wound. He shouted, "Physiological salt solution!" And a woman assistant thrust two large needles, about the thickness of a cigarette, into the man's chest, to pour 1,000 cubic centimeters of salt solution into the dead man's bloodstream to maintain blood pressure. The man's face was lifeless, blue. The lips had turned purple. Then Garalov was untied from the table, transferred to a table on wheels, and taken back to his room. His heart was beating, and he was breathing, but consciousness did not return, and perhaps never returned, to the final moment when the heart, pumped full of camphor and salt, stopped beating, when, 37 hours later, there were no more doctors and no more camphor, and he died, perhaps because up to the last minute no one was admitted to him, apart from the two professors and a nurse. But an hour before the death of Army Commander Garolov was officially announced, a patient who happened to be in the neighboring room heard strange sounds, as if a man was tapping out a message, as men do in prison. In that room lay a living corpse, saturated with camphor, because the properties of the medical profession do not permit a man to die under the surgeon's knife. The professors guarded that room so carefully because the army commander was dying there, a hero of the Civil War, a hero of the Great Russian Revolution, a man overgrown with legends. He who had had the will and the right to send men to kill other men and to die. The operation had begun at 8:39, and Garolov was taken out of the operating room on a wheeled table at 11 minutes after 11. At that time, in the corridor, Professor Lozovsky was met by the porter, who told him that there had been 2 telephone calls for him from house number 1. And again, the porter came and said that someone was on the telephone. Lozovsky went to the telephone. He was expecting a call from house number 1. In the receiver, he heard, "Darling, I miss you so much." And for a moment, Lozovsky bared his teeth and perhaps was about to say something vicious. But he said nothing, threw down the receiver. The professor went over to the window in the office where the telephone was, stood looking out at the first snow for a while, chewed his fingers, and then returned to the telephone. He penetrated the network that had 30 or 40 lines, bowed to the receiver, and said that the operation had been successful, but the patient was very weak, and they, the doctors, had judged his condition to be grave. He begged to be excused from reporting in person immediately. Upstairs in the corridor, between the operating room and the room of the patient, where people had been bustling and whispering that morning, there was now not a soul to be seen. Garolov died. That is, Professor Lozovsky came out of his room with a sheet of white paper and, head bowed, announced sadly and solemnly that the sick army commander, Citizen Nikolai Ivanovich Garolov, had passed away at 17 minutes after 1 in the morning, to everyone's great sorrow. 3/4 of an hour later, toward 2 o'clock in the morning, several companies of Red Army men entered the hospital yard, and sentries were placed at all passageways and stairways. Into the room where the army commander's corpse lay strode the same general staff managers who had come to the station to meet him. Garolov, the helmsman in charge of the enormous machine known as the army, had been in charge of these men's lives, and now they had come to take charge of the commander's corpse. At that hour, the second roosters crow in the villages. At that hour, clouds were creeping across the sky, and hurrying after them came a plump moon, already tiring of the chase. At that hour, Professor Lozovsky was being taken in a closed Rolls to pay a special visit to house number 1. Noiselessly, the Rolls entered the gateway with the griffins, passed the sentries, and drew up at the entrance. A sentry opened the automobile door. Lozovsky went through to the study, where 3 telephones stood on the red felt of the desk, and buttons were lined up on the wall behind the desk, like a company at attention. It is not known what was said at that interview, but it lasted only 3 minutes. Lozovsky came out of the study, out of the main door, out of the yard, in a great hurry, holding his hat and coat in his hands like a character out of Hoffman. The automobile had gone. Lozovsky walked unsteadily, like a drunken man. The streets were deserted at that still nocturnal hour, and the streets swayed together with Lozovsky. The streets swayed beneath the moon, with Lozovsky in the still wastes of night. Hoffman-like, Losovsky left the study of house number 1. The unbending man remained in the study. The man stood behind the desk, leaning over it on his fists. The man's head was bowed. He remained motionless for a long time. He had been torn from his papers on formulas. And then the man began to move. His movements were angular and precise, as the formulas that he dictated to his stenographer every night. He began to move very quickly. He pressed a button behind him. He picked up a receiver. He said to the man on duty, "The open racer." He spoke into the telephone to one of the ruling troika, who must have been asleep at that hour. His voice was weak. "My dear Andrei, another one has gone. Kolya Garilov is dead. We have lost a comrade in arms. Would you mind calling Potap?" To the chauffeur, the unbending man said, "The hospital." The streets were not swaying. In the clouds, the moon was hurrying, bustling, and like a whip, the automobile snaked through the streets. The hospital building, black in the gloom, blinked its restless windows. Sentries stood in black passageways. The building was numb, as a place of death must be numb. Through black corridors, the unbending man made his way to Commander Garilov's room. He went in. There, on the bed, lay the body of the army commander. The smell of camphor was stifling. Everyone left the room, and only the unbending man and the body of a man, Garilov, remained. The man sat down on the bed by the feet of the corpse. Garilov's arms lay along his sides, on top of the blanket. The man sat for a long time by the corpse, bending over it, quiescent. Silence filled the room. The man took Garilov's hand, pressed it, said, "Farewell, comrade. Farewell, brother." And he left the room, head bowed. Not looking at anyone, he said, "Why doesn't somebody open a window? It's suffocating in there." Walked quickly down the black corridor and descended the staircase. At that hour, in the villages, the third roosters were crowing. Silently the man got into the automobile. The chauffeur turned his head to listen to the order. The man was silent. The man pulled himself together. The man said, "Out of town, as fast as you can go." The automobile tore from the spot, in top gear, turning fan-like, casting shafts of light. Began snipping splinters of alleys, street signs, streets. The air at once grew firm, began to blow as a wind, whistled inside the automobile. Streets, houses, street lamps flew back. The street lamps swung their lights, swooped down, and retreated headlong. At full speed, the automobile tore out of town, striving to tear itself out of its very self. The gas burners of suburban streetcar lines had already disappeared. Already the village huts were scattering like sheep in a yelping of dogs. The canvas of the highway was already invisible, and now and then, at those moments when the automobile flew through the air, the noise of the wheels was lost. Air, wind, time, and earth whistled, screamed, howled, leaped, rushed forward. And in this colossal rush, with everything rushing forward, only the moon behind the clouds and the automobile, and this man sitting calmly in the automobile, moving in parallel motion, became motionless objects. At the edge of the same forest where Gavrilov and Popov had been a few days before, the man gave the order, "Stop!" And the automobile broke speed, having rendered space, time, and wind superfluous, having stopped the earth and made the moon chase the clouds. The man did not know that a few nights before, Garilov had been near this forest. The man got out of the automobile and, silently and slowly, went into the forest. The forest stood still in the snow. and the moon hurried above it. There was no one for the man to talk to. It was some time before the man came back from the forest. On returning and getting into the automobile, he said, "Let's go back. There's no hurry." The automobile approached the city when dawn was already breaking, red, crimson, cold. The sun was rising in the east. There below, in violet and blue, in a radiant mist, in a haze, lay the city. The man took it in with a cold glance. Of the moon in the sky, all that remained at that hour was a barely perceptible melting icy lump. In the snowy silence, the rumble of the city could not be heard. Last chapter. The evening after Army Commander Gavrilov's funeral, when military brass bands had done blaring and banners were no longer lowered, in the morning, after thousands of mourners had passed, and the body of the man was freezing in the earth, and with the earth, Popov fell asleep in his room. He awoke at some strange hour, sitting at the table. The room was dark, and Natasha was crying softly. Popov bent over his daughter, took her in his arms, and walked around the room with her. A white moon, weary of hovering through the sky, was pushing its way through the window. Popov went over to the window and looked out at the snow and the stillness of the night outside. Natasha slid down from his arms and stood on the windowsill. In Popov's pocket was a letter from Gavrilov, the last note that he had written the night before he entered the hospital. The note said, "Alyosha, brother, I knew that I was going to die. Forgive me, but you are not a young man anymore. I was rocking your little girl on my knee, and I was thinking, my wife is old too, and you have known her for 20 years. I have written to her. And you write to her too. Go and live together. Marry if you like. Bring up the children. Farewell, Alyosha." Natasha was standing on the windowsill, and Popov saw she was puffing out her cheeks, sticking out her lips, looking at the moon, taking aim at the moon, and blowing at it. "What are you doing, Natasha?" her father asked. "I want to blow out the moon," Natasha replied. The moon, plump as a merchant's wife, swam behind clouds, wearying of the chase. It was the hour when the city machine was beginning to come to life, when factory whistles were sounding. The whistles were long drawn out, 1, 2, 3, many of them, merging into a gray howl over the city. It was quite clear that the whistles were the soul of the city, now frosted by the moon, howling. Moscow, Povarskaya Street, January 9th, 1926.